Hi, everyone. I'm Ryan Polk. I'm a senior policy advisor at the Internet Society, and thank you all for joining this showcase session on the Global Encryption Coalition. And thanks again to Forum Europe for having us at this event. So I wanted to talk to you today about the Global Encryption Coalition, which is a group of civil society, private sector, and technologists who work to promote and defend encryption around the world. It was started earlier this year by the Internet Society, along with the Center for Democracy and Technology and Global Partners Digital. And I'm joined here today by some colleagues from those organizations, Averna McGowan, who's the director of the Europe office for CDT, Center for Democracy and Technology, where she leads the Brussels-based Europe team in an effort to put human rights and democracy at the center of the European Union and its member countries' tech policy agendas. I'm also joined by Sheetal Kumar, who's the senior program lead at Global Partners Digital, where she provides strategic oversight for GPD's global cybersecurity capacity building program, and also works in civil society engagement in relevant forums like the UN and other multilateral forums. So today we wanted to give you some context about the global encryption debate in general, but also the debate in Europe and what the encryption debate there in the European Union looks like before we get into what the Global Encryption Coalition is and what we're trying to achieve and how you could help. So to start off with the context of the global encryption debate, you first have to go really broadly to what is encryption. And encryption is the way that we can scramble data so that only someone with the means to return it to a readable state can read it. It often means only your intended recipient and the person who created the data in the first place can read the data. At its core is end-to-end encryption, and end-to-end encryption is where no third party, not even the company who provides the service, the communication service, can read that data. Only the intended recipient and the creator of that data, that message, can actually read that data. It's the most secure form of encryption out there, and a very important one. We use encryption every single day. If you've used a credit card today with a chip in it, you've used encryption 3 times in one transaction. You've used it in between the card reader and your credit card, in between the card reader and the bank, and at the bank itself, where encryption is used to protect your data. Encryption also protects vulnerable communities. It's particularly important for protecting dissidents and human rights defenders in countries that are not human rights respecting. But it's also important for protecting LGBTQ plus individuals in the process of coming out, especially in situations where they're under threat. And it's also used to help to provide help to people in domestic violence situations. For instance, WhatsApp, which is an end-to-end encrypted communication service. There's services on WhatsApp that allow people in domestic violence situations to reach out and get help securely, and not have to worry as much about their communications being surveilled and potentially putting them into bad situation. Encryption also underpins the digital economy. It protects a lot of our data online. It should protect all of our data online, and is really the key to securing the digital economy and ensuring that the economy keeps growing, especially now when we have COVID-19 and we have to do so much social distancing and so much of our lives have moved online. So given all these really great things I've said about encryption, you might be wondering, why is there a debate about encryption? How is it under threat? Here's the thing. Encryption protects anyone who uses it. And there's no way of deciding for some people to use encryption and some people not to use encryption. That means that bad guys, criminals, can also use encryption as well and gain the same benefits as you and me. The unfortunate thing is there's expert consensus that there's no way to provide third-party access to an end-to-end encrypted communication system without undermining that security and undermining encryption for all of those who use it. So there's no way to provide targeted access to get to the bad guys' data without weakening the security of everyone. And that's really where the crux of the encryption debate lies. Governments want access to the data of bad guys, but at the same time, we can't lose the security provided by end-to-end encryption for everyone, especially for vulnerable communities like the ones I mentioned earlier. Can you bring up the slide, please? So how has the global encryption debate evolved over the years? So this debate's been going on for about 25, maybe closer now to 30 years, on and off. And in the beginning, it really was focused on this concept of encryption backdoors. So how can you can you alter an encryption system so that you can provide immediate access to law enforcement, for law enforcement to get access to the data of a bad guy? And this concept of an encryption backdoor was introduced. And basically, this is a method that makes it easy to get access. One of these approaches that was talked about was key escrow. So with encryption, you use an encryption key to encrypt and decrypt the data. With key escrow, the government or a third party would also hold that key and also have the ability to decrypt that data. The problem with that approach is suddenly you've got a very, very valuable thing in the hands of another party, which could be stolen and used by criminals to break in and steal the data as well. So one very interesting thing about the encryption debate is the technical approaches, the language, and the rationale have changed really a lot over the last 5 or 6 years. So while in the beginning it was a focus on encryption backdoors, once civil society and academia debunked encryption backdoors as a bad idea, suddenly the language used by governments and proponents of undermining encryption changed. It became a euphemistic language of lawful access, exceptional access, trying to stop criminals from going dark, or providing something called responsible encryption, which would basically be an encryption backdoor. Now we've even moved it farther, which is this concept of traceability. What governments say is we don't necessarily need to see every piece of content, but we need to be able to trace content back to see who put it online in the first place, or who put this viral message full of misinformation together. The technical approaches have similarly changed. So while in the past it was focused on key escrow, now things like government hacking or client-side scanning have come to the fore. Client-side scanning being the idea of looking at the content, scanning for bad content before the data is encrypted at all or afterwards. Lastly, the rationale has changed. In the past, terrorism was front and foremost what governments focused on when trying to undermine encryption as a reasoning for that. Then it moved to drug cartels. But now really the focus is on hate speech, misinformation, and stopping child exploitation online. But while the rationale has changed, the reality remains the same of there's no way to provide access to encrypted data, end-to-end encrypted data, without undermining that system and undermining the security that it provides for everyone. So that was a 10-minute really quick introduction to what the encryption debate is and what encryption is. And I'm going to pass it now on to my colleague Averna to give an overview of the encryption debate in Europe.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. As was said, I am the Europe Director of the Centre for Democracy and Technology, and I only started at the beginning of October, so I'm very happy this early on in my tenure to join this discussion today. And thank you. I believe that a lot of those global trends, conversations are exactly playing out in the European policy field as well. I do think it's probably worth noticing that, you know, in the European Union context, since the 1990s, encryption has been seen as an essential element, not only from a fundamental rights perspective, but also about supporting and keeping intact the European economy. It was, if we look back at some of the developments and the reopening of the debate, if you like, at European level, you can link that to a string of horrendous terrorist attacks when this item was put back on the agenda in Europe. And what is interesting in the European Union context and draws to the heart of the tension in this debate is that, of course, the European Union is known as a global champion for privacy rights, for fundamental rights. And so therefore it is unusual that we see at the same time at the European policy level still this discussion about whether or not we need to totally safeguard encryption. I should mention my background is a human rights lawyer, and from a human rights law perspective, of course, there's very strong reasoning, and I'll get to some of that in a moment, about to echo what other colleagues have said about the importance of encryption. So the last European Commission was already discussing the question of law enforcement authorities' access to certain encrypted data. They did not take any action, but they had increased things like more funding to Europol, thinking of different solutions. And then near the end of the last Commission mandate, of course, we had a number of policy proposals put on the table that are better known as a workaround approach to encryption. Now, the problem is, as was already explained very clearly, is some of those so-called workaround encryption essentially come back down to breaking and undermining the key principles of encryption, because it looks at things like government hacking, like brute force and other options. So that is quite concerning. The debate on encryption, if we move it along now to the current time at the European Union, it is back on the agenda again in very concrete ways. So we have, for example, the e-privacy directive, and in particular, an interim regulation that was taken on that in more recent times. We also have debates about dual use, the export of dual use technologies. So technologies that can be used maybe for one purpose, but also in terms of surveillance. And I should add, as I'm working for many years with human rights defenders, with investigative journalists, I have firsthand experience of the very real harm to our democracies that some of these dual use surveillance techniques can have, that real chilling effect, and the question of, you know, how do we protect and ensure that. And then there's also a leaked paper that just in the last few weeks that we would have seen on technical solutions to detect child sexual abuse in end-to-end encryption communications. So what I would really like to just stress, and in terms of the European Union debates as well, is that I do think that the European Union has a real role to play in being a global champion for encryption. And some of these more recent policy developments or slight increments are quite concerning. I would like to stress that, of course, there are the very important point that we need to remember is, you know, it can be quite emotional for people to say, yes, but we want to, of course, you know, who doesn't want to combat terrorism? Who doesn't want to, of course, protect child's rights? It's extremely important. And I've fought for that my entire career as a human rights lawyer. But the matter of the fact is that actually what different pieces of legislation are doing is that they're undermining the integrity of our very justice systems. So we just need to be very clear, and the United Nations Human Rights Committee has been very clear on these points as well, that it is extremely important that we safeguard encryption as a manner to ensure that the different tenets of our democracy are kept in place, but also that any measures that are taken really adhere to very strict legality principles. So they have to be evidence-based. You know, there has to be judicial safeguards and others. And ultimately, at an international level under human rights law, we can see that because by default, encryption wanders into this point about the mass surveillance or gathering of information, that it will never in any case meet that threshold. So, you know, the EU's own Fundamental Rights Agency has come out very strongly on the importance of encryption as well. So for me, the bottom line is at the European level that Europe has a real opportunity to maintain its reputation as a champion of privacy and the importance of encryption. And I do think that in these individual policy debates, it'll be extremely important that the EU continues to play that role and doesn't fall into any of the pitfalls or the, you know, the perhaps sometimes even misleading arguments about the importance of breaking down encryption or providing backdoor by a different mean. Maybe just one that I think is that I would conclude on is I have worked internationally on human rights. And a few years ago, when I would say things like, look, I can see, for example, in other countries outside the European Union, how somebody who's actually an investigative journalist, how somebody who is a human rights defender or working in their community is labeled as a terrorist. And that's why I'm so concerned about loosely worded language or laws on this. In the same way, I would say that I'm very concerned to see about safeguards about who can be prosecuted being watered down because when the government is just going down its energies. And that, as I said, seemed like an abstract debate in Europe, but unfortunately, as we know, rule of law issues are very high on the European Union agenda, and we are seeing encroachments on the work of journalists, on human rights defenders and others, which for me only now makes even more real the idea that we need to be extremely careful with any measures that are taken, and we need to very securely safeguard encryption, fundamentally to keep the integrity of our justice systems and to keep the EU's reputation as a global privacy champion. Thank you.
Thanks, Averna. Sheetal.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here, and thank you for the invitation to speak. I'm going to speak a bit now about the Global Encryption Coalition itself, and I think leave plenty of time for questions from you as well, and for some interaction, because this introduction shouldn't take too long. So, as Ryan laid out, there are many different types of attempts to undermine encryption in terms of the rationale, the language used, and the technical approaches, which are also being proposed. And the debate has evolved over the years. And Iverna, you covered the many facets of the discussion in the European Union and the different technologies that are part of this debate as well, and made that point that key principles need to be adhered to, rule of law safeguards, but unfortunately this is not happening globally. And that's exactly why the Global Encryption Coalition was founded. And so we were founded in January this year by 3 organizations, all represented here, CDT, the Internet Society, and GPD. And we now form the steering committee members of the coalition. And the aim of the Global Encryption Coalition is to defend strong encryption, including end-to-end encryption, as Ryan, you mentioned, wherever it is under threat, through legislative proposals, policy proposals, and the kind of situations and proposals for technical approaches, and the rationale being given, and the narrative we're hearing, which Ryan and Verna, you've already discussed. So I wouldn't go into that. And our coalition members are from all over the world. It's sort of on the tin, as we say. It's a global coalition, and so we're represented in all regions of the world. And we're also a very broad-based coalition, or kind of umbrella of civil society organizations, academics, technologists, and companies as well, big and small. And what unites us is our commitment to the founding statement, which you can find on our website. I'm happy to pop that into the chat. And as it says in our founding statement, we call on governments and the private sector as well to reject efforts to undermine encryption and to pursue actively policies that enhance, strengthen, and promote the use of strong encryption to protect people everywhere. And so we also support the efforts of companies that do the same. And we launched publicly in May this year. We were meant to launch in person at RightsCon, but of course we were unable to do that. So instead we held a series of webinars to cover all regions of the world and the different contexts in which this issue is playing out, and that provided us the opportunity to, with participants from all over the world, hone into how exactly these issues that we've discussed, these incredibly important issues, are playing out. We hosted one focused on the EU entitled "The European Union, Online Trust and COVID-19: What's Next for Encryption in Europe." It's available on the website, so do take a look if you weren't able to join us back in May. So that's the why and the where and the when and the who of the coalition. To the what, what we do. As I mentioned, where there are proposals to undermine strong encryption, we're active there, supporting local efforts through our members, but also in relevant global forums. So, for example, we've just released a statement in response to the recent letter by the Five Eyes grouping and India and Japan, which you can find on our website, along with a number of other statements we have taken together. And so, as I said, we support local members in their advocacy, amplifying their efforts, helping to create convenings between different stakeholders in order to push back against efforts to undermine encryption. I'll stop there because I know that there's some time now to discuss and take questions, but just to end on that point, which I think my colleagues made as well, in this context now, as our lives we're all collectively more dependent on digital technologies, we really see this as a really important time to be defending strong encryption, and the efforts of the coalition continue to work for that. So thanks so much, Ryan.
Thanks, Sheetal. And so now I think we'll move to questions from the audience. But while we're waiting for questions, I think I'll use my moderator privilege to ask a question of my own, which is, how do we change the minds of governments who seem to have made up their minds already on encryption, perhaps in ways that we don't want them to be thinking about encryption? And do we have a good chance of changing their minds? I don't know, Sheetal or Verna, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, advocacy, 101 is to recognize where the other person is coming from. So I think it's very important as any advocates to listen and engage with the concerns of whether it's government officials or politicians, and then to really lay on the table clearly what the alternate solutions are. I mean, you mentioned quite nicely right at the beginning is we want to take down the bad guys. I think it's a way of saying, look, by investing in different avenues, whether that's in further training for collecting evidence in different ways, whether it's in preventative measures, I think an important part of the advocacy is to show that we recognize that what they're trying to do is legitimate, that it's in the public interest, but that there are alternative ways of doing it, because by taking on encryption itself, you're kind of knocking a pillar of the system in a way, and that is disproportionate to the aim that you're trying to pursue. So I do be an effective advocate. You do need to genuinely listen and then find practical and meaningful alternatives to the aims, because look, we all agree that these heinous crimes, people need to be held to account. That's absolutely clear. I think it's just a matter of how do we go about doing that while still respecting human rights and the rule of law is the important point.
Thanks, Verna. I completely agree. And I think another side too of this is ensuring that governments understand the value that encryption and that end-to-end encryption play in their success as countries and the safety of their people, because like I said earlier, it underpins so much that we just don't realize, and the people making decisions in governments may not realize that as well. And so ensuring that they understand the positive side of encryption is I think, really crucial. So looking at the chat, I think we have another question about the recent Encrypto chat case. So this was a case that made headlines earlier this year, where the Dutch and French government, their law enforcement agencies, managed to dismantle an illegal encrypted phone network and conduct a series of investigations that I believe ended up arresting over 700 people in this network in organized crime in Europe. So the question was, can we comment on the findings of the case? And I'll jump in really quickly first and say that this is a really interesting case because it's an interesting case study in an investigation that was done without putting in an encryption backdoor, without weakening encryption to do so. So with this case, there was an illegal encrypted phone network that was set up across Europe that was being used by criminals to do their own operations. Of course, this did present a challenge for law enforcement because their communications were encrypted and they weren't able to get access to that. However, they didn't actually weaken the security of that system in order to gain access. What they did was they actually hacked the system using government hacking. Not sure if it was done through a third party or through the government themselves, but they found an existing vulnerability that was in this encrypted phone network, and then they exploited that vulnerability to gain access. So they didn't actually work with the providers of EncroChat. They instead found existing vulnerabilities to get inside. This is, I think, a really interesting case to look at because it was so successful, but also because of that method that they used. There's so much of a focus from law enforcement on encryption backdoors and providing third-party access by design. But when you provide third-party access by design, what you're really doing is creating an intentional vulnerability. There's already going to be vulnerabilities out there in every single system that's ever been created. That's an encrypted system has vulnerabilities, and governments can do things like this and find those vulnerabilities, hack them, and break in. Why governments don't really want to do it is because it's expensive and it's resource intensive. But at the same time, something that's expensive and resource intensive is also a really good practical check on overreach, because if it's resource intensive and expensive, you can't do it all the time. And I think this is a really good example of that because this was where they deemed that breaking into this illegal phone network would be worth the money, worth the resources, and it showed that they can do it. They can hack into these networks, and when they do, they can be very, very successful because you have networks like this that connect all these people, all these suspects in Europe. I don't know, Averna, would you like to jump in on that? Or
I mean, I'm not as familiar with the case, but to say I think there's an important factor when you said, you know, that the network in itself, the legality of the network. I mean, that's an interesting point to clarify, you know, the difference if we're talking about more mainstream like Signal or WhatsApp or other communication networks. But also just to say, again, law is very clear on this, that we need that if governments are going to intercept communication, it has to be judicially authorized, it has to be narrowly targeted, based on reasonable suspicion, and of course it has to be necessary and proportionate to a legitimate aim. And I think that framework, and making sure, from what I'm calling from Brussels, to make sure that kind of framework and safeguards are copper fast in any regulations and laws that are coming, is so important.
Completely agree. And actually, a really interesting thing, they're mentioning the legality of the network. So one of the major issues with encryption backdoors and introducing encryption legislation that demands third-party access to encrypted communications is the issue of the legality of those communication systems. In the case for major criminal organizations, they're going to use end-to-end encryption whether it's legal or not, because let's be honest, what they're talking about will probably give them a bigger sentence than using end-to-end encryption. And in the case of EncroChat, I can't remember if it was legal or not, but this was a phone network that was really only used by criminals. It wasn't like Signal or WhatsApp where this is used by everyone. But when you create laws that mandate breaking end-to-end encryption or providing third-party access, it's really the average user who's going to lose out in the end and lose that security, because Signal and WhatsApp and more mainstream end-to-end encrypted communication systems, they're the ones who will have to comply. Ones like EncroChat, wherever they were actually set up, they might just not comply and be used by criminals. So the average person would lose out on the security, whereas that criminal network would continue to still have end-to-end encryption. So I see another question, one from Octavian Popesco from EU Comreg. They asked, is there any legislation that makes end-to-end encryption illegal in the EU, or that compromises it? Or that compromises it? I don't know, Sheetal or Averna, would you like to take that one?
I can go. I mean, I actually, in the statement I had made earlier, I actually mentioned, so there are a number of policy, like laws being debated that have not been agreed yet, where the Centre for Democracy and Technology is concerned about undermining safeguards and encryption. So I mentioned there's the e-privacy directive, and in particular, there's an interim regulation on that, where there's very broad language. There's an increased talk about things like upload filters, you know, and there's also, of course, this, as I also mentioned, the leak that we were talking about to end-to-end encryption in the context of detecting child sexual abuse. So there again, there are provisions in there that we would be very concerned about in terms of protecting and safeguarding the principle of encryption more generally.
Thanks, Verna. So I see another question from Mehdi Charib from Fern Uni Hageb, and that question is, what are the law enforcement objections to encryption? And Sheetal, would you want to take a stab at that one?
Sure. So I think Averna touched upon this before, actually, when, or one aspect of this, when she mentioned that, you know, there are very, you know, serious crimes being perpetrated by the internet, and you know, they do need responses, but those responses need to be proportionate. And undermining encryption is a disproportionate response for all the reasons that we've outlined, and I would, you know, labor those. And I think what we often hear is the case being made that these crimes need to be solved, and that encryption creates an obstacle to solving crimes. But, you know, in trying to address the issue of crime by undermining encryption, because we all depend on it so much, and the security of the network at large depends on it, we, you know, what we're saying is that undermining it is a disproportionate response, and there are alternative ways that respect, that are human rights respecting and preserve the stability and security of the internet, which need to be pursued instead of these proposals, which would undermine the security of all users. And, you know, I think linked to that very closely is the importance of keeping processes where these policies are made and these issues are being discussed open, so that the narrative and the challenges being faced by certain stakeholders do not dominate the narrative in a way that is, not reflective of the issue as a whole. And that's why it's very important to have stakeholders, those who work with marginalized groups, civil society groups, technologists, to understand in terms of the technical approaches, what the ramifications are. All of these different stakeholders need to be in the room so that the challenges being faced by law enforcement can also be addressed in a way that is respectful of human rights and all of the other benefits that encryption provides. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thanks, Chantal. I think it does. So the next question that came in is, wouldn't the development of emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence and dark web analysis tools combined with traditional methods of investigation be enough for the digital dimension of police work without the need of weakening encryption? I can jump in on that one if others are okay with that. So I think that's a really great question. And while I can't really speak to those emerging technologies and the efficacy of them, I think the concept of using traditional methods of investigation in the digital age is really a key one, and one that I think law enforcement and those who support law enforcement need to look more into. If you look at the case really recently, I'm from the United States, and there was a wild criminal case in recent news where a group of people were suspected of trying to kidnap, attempting to kidnap one of our state governors in the United States. If you look at how they actually did that investigation, a lot of the information that they got was from an encrypted messaging service. How they got that information was kind of a traditional method of police work done in the digital age, which was they got an informant who was one of the members of that group message on the encrypted platform. And so because they had this informant who was already in the conversation, they got access to all of the communications being sent across that platform in that group message. And so they used a very old traditional method of police work, which is getting an informant on the inside, but then combine that with the power of this messaging system to gather tons of information about what these suspected, what these suspects were planning, and get enough evidence for them to actually make the arrests and prevent something bad from happening. And so there's, I think, a lot of work that needs to be done on ensuring that law enforcement has the training that they need and their understanding that they need of what's available without breaking encryption, and kind of the creative ways that they can use these traditional methods of investigation in the digital age. Because getting informants or breaking down the door of a suspect's house once you have a lawful warrant, the value of that hasn't really gone away with end-to-end encryption. The only thing that has changed with end-to-end encryption is it's now a little bit harder than it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, to get access to the treasure trove of data that was being sent unencrypted across the internet. But those traditional methods of investigation are still really valid, and I think need to be leaned on more, because breaking encryption is not the silver bullet that law enforcement wants it to be. Don't know, Werner or Chantal, would you want to jump in on this anymore? Or?
The only brief point I would add is, obviously, as we're seeing across digital rights areas, is just a word of caution about artificial intelligence and the fact that we now know, it's very well documented, how offline prejudice and discrimination find their way into algorithms, and that's a concern just about predictive policing measures, that it is, of course, very possible to harness those technologies in a positive way, but we do need more transparency on how those algorithms are being used, and really to make sure that we do not see the many problems that we have in our justice systems in terms of, racial profiling and discrimination, that we wouldn't kind of almost turbo boost that into the digital world by use of artificial intelligence. So just, I guess, a word of caution, there.
Thanks, Averna. And I think we have 5 minutes left. I'll take a moment see if any other questions come in. But otherwise, I think we'll move on now to kind of closing statements. Sheetal, would you like to give a quick closing statement?
Well, thanks so much, Ryan. Thanks for this really interesting and I think important discussion, for all comments and questions as well. I want to end with a kind of call to action for those of you who are watching, who are technologists, academics, companies or civil society organizations who share our mission and are interested in joining. Please do visit the website. But I think what we have said here is not, as Averna just mentioned, it's not necessarily a new problem. It's an old problem, and new solutions are not necessarily, just because they're new technologies, good ones. And we have the rule of law, we have our principles, we have human rights frameworks. Those need to be abided by and respected. And that otherwise, I think the future looks pretty grim. And supporting a secure and stable internet is absolutely key to the well-being of all, I think, human beings in the future. As we have seen, we're becoming increasingly dependent. So let's safeguard the internet. Let's safeguard our rights. And as we've mentioned, there are alternative ways to address very serious, the very serious issue of crime. And we need to explore those in an inclusive way in order to address the issues we've discussed. Thanks.
Thanks, Sheetal. Averna?
Thank you very much. And I saw that we had a question regarding the CJEU decision regarding the Privacy International case. So because we're closing on time, I could talk about that for a very long time, but I do think that this was a very positive case. You can see that the European Court of Justice, which has a long history of protecting privacy rights, has weighed in very heavily. So I would really hope the fact that some of the current initiatives haven't been dropped immediately means it hasn't had an immediate effect. But I would hope that that's a very strong signal about the emphasis that the court places on privacy rights of the way out in this debate, and also how integral that is to the European legal framework. And just in terms of also concluding remarks, along with colleagues, I guess a call to action. We're working, there's so many files at the European Union level, as we've discussed today. And it's a Centre for Democracy and Technology. We really need as many champions as we can across Brussels to support these initiatives and to find workable and practical solutions. So please do join us in protecting encryption in Europe as a key protection of our justice systems and of democracy. And I look forward to working with you all over the coming months on that.
Thank you, Averna. And to echo both of my colleagues, we can't do this alone, and we need the help. There's no way we can stop governments from weakening encryption if it's just the three of us here. And so we welcome any help that we can get, and we're happy to work with you and help make the impact that civil society and the private sector and academia can really have on the encryption debate, and move the debate forward, and ensure that governments don't weaken encryption, and that more end-to-end encryption and stronger security is introduced and implemented for people everywhere. So I think we're almost out of time, but as it says on the little ticker underneath the screen, I'll be available for further discussions after this showcase in a meeting. So please, I welcome you all there to continue this conversation. But for now, thank you. And thank you, Averna and Sheetal, for the awesome remarks.
Thank you all so much.